or the rest of the conference is the West, and here we're talking about the rest, I think. And that's unfortunately quite common, but it's great that we do get these other perspectives. One of the things that Paolo didn't mention this morning was that among the giants of high-tech companies, we are now finding names like Alibaba, like Tencent, like Baidu. These are these Chinese companies that are not very familiar, are certainly not as well known in the West as your various Amazon, Google, and Facebook, but they're huge companies not only in China, they're really making headway in a lot of other countries. And so a lot of the phenomena that we discussed this morning and we'll discuss in the rest of the conference are taking place with huge variations in different countries. And we're very lucky to have a brilliant panel that, with only 4 people will take on geographically really the rest of the world. So we have India, we have China, we have the Middle East, and Indonesia and India, Southeast Asia, South Asia, so not too bad for 4 people. So we'll start with Jacqueline Hicks, talking about the Asian data giants. So over to you.
Hello everyone. I'm presenting a project that I haven't yet started, that I'll be starting in a couple of months in Nottingham. It's difficult for me to really establish how much you know in the audience, so bear with me if this is all old news. Like, one of the biggest sins that you can commit in anything to do with the digital is telling you something you've already heard. But this is what I'll be doing, which is really about personal data, and thinking about personal data as an economic resource. We've all heard the metaphor that it's the new oil, which is a metaphor that fits in some ways, but doesn't fit in other ways. But it that opens up the possibility that it's an economic resource which has to be kind of extracted and refined by these big companies that we're hearing about all the time, Google and Facebook and Alibaba. So this is personal data that we all leave on these websites, in the search engines and the e-commerce platforms. And as we think of personal data as an economic resource, it also allows us the possibility to think of it as, to think of the activities that we do to create personal data as digital labor, which then opens up the possibility that this is something that we should be paid for. So another piece of background is around the General Data Protection Regulation, the GDPR, which many of you will, I'm sure, have heard of. This is a European regulation that applies only to those of us who are living in Europe. It is due to come into force in a couple of weeks' time. This is a regulation that has a lot of elements to it, really, but it's about personal data, greater protection for personal data. It's a really big headache for companies who are working, these kind of big tech companies who work in the digital economy, and the stakes are really very high for these companies. And I think it's instructive that some of the European MPs that worked on creating this regulation, the GDPR, they said that in all their years of creating regulations that they encountered the fiercest lobbying that they'd ever encountered, particularly from the US tech firms when they were writing this regulation. Now, it was written in 2016, but as I say, it's due to come into force like really soon, in the next couple of weeks. And I think one of the most interesting aspects of the GDPR for me is that it popularizes, starts to regularize this concept of data portability. So this concept is the idea that you, as the data subject, should be able to request your data from the platforms in easily readable form, that you can change your data, you can move your data to another platform. So what this is doing really is changing the nature of ownership of personal data. So now you effectively own your own data rather than the platform owning your data. And this is really putting a lot of pressure on the entire business model of these big tech companies like Google and Facebook. That's a bit of background about what's happening in Europe, but my presentation today is really about what's happening around personal data ownership in another part of the world, in Asia and in Indonesia and India in particular. Because while the trend is to kind of loosen the stranglehold, to try and loosen the stranglehold of the corporate sector on ownership of the personal data that we're creating within Europe, the trend is actually in exactly the opposite direction in Asia. And I'm looking in particular at India and Indonesia. So many describe this as a kind of new form of colonialism, a kind of digital colonialism. So instead of the last century's extraction of natural resources like, say, tin and oil and things like that in the developing world, now we see the extraction of personal data from parts of the developing world, or if we're talking about India and Indonesia, they're really kind of seen as emerging economies rather than developing countries now. And so both Facebook and Google have got projects all over Africa and Asia. These are ostensibly philanthropic efforts to provide what they call free access to the internet. So Facebook's program is called Free Basics, while Google has its Loon project. Facebook uses drones with enormous wingspans the length of a Boeing 737 with just a little drone on it, to kind of hover around the atmosphere, to provide connectivity to rural populations who don't have it. Google's Loon project is using these great big balloons to float around 20 kilometers up in the atmosphere to do the same. So what both these companies are doing is they're working with local telecommunications companies in India and Indonesia and elsewhere in the world to offer connectivity to people who have mobile phones. They have a contract with a local telecommunication company, but if they connect through the app to use, say, Free Basics, then they can do that at zero data usage, right? So they're not paying for the data. And there is some benefit to the population, the rural populations for this, of course. But this is also, you've got to think about balancing this between the benefit for the tech companies who are really doing this as part of their business model in order to harvest the data of these massive populations of people, these very tech-savvy young populations who live in India and Indonesia. And this is also, they're also keen to move into Asia because as we can see here by the internet penetration rates, there's still a lot of growth potential in Asia, whereas in the West, for users of their products and for users of the internet, Whereas in the West, it's kind of, the users are starting to kind of flatten out, right? There's kind of reaching saturation points. So free basics was particularly controversial in India and was in fact banned by the Indian government a couple of years ago. And it was banned because it went against the principles of net neutrality. These principles that the internet should be the same wherever it is in the world that you're accessing the internet. You should be able to have access to the full internet, and that you should be able to have it at the same speed everywhere in the world. So it was banned in India. In Indonesia, there's really been no public debates at all about net neutrality, and in lots of the places around the world where free basics has been rolled out and is operating right now, there's not been such a kind of public discussion. For Loon, Google's Loon is still in the development phase, still kind of developing and testing phase. They have not said that they will restrict the internet in the same way that free basics would. So free basics only allowed people to access Facebook and maybe about 20 or 30 other sites, right? So you couldn't see a lot of the internet. So although Google is not saying that they're going to restrict the internet for people using zero data usage, there is still concerns about handing over such power to an already very powerful company. So if they become an ISP, an internet service provider, as well as this kind of massive platform, then that's kind of like handing over quite a lot of power and potential control to them. So as I say, this is the background to a new project that I'll be starting in a few months around the emerging international political economy of personal data. And it's going to be bringing together Indian and Indonesian internet activists and academics, and looking at the decisions that governments make in relation to these kind of issues around internet connectivity. So I guess the important point that I want to make is that, that perhaps for you guys to take away today is that internet connectivity and personal data ownership, in some ways it kind of feels like quite a dry topic, but it's not just a business or a technical issue, that it does have real potential, far-reaching implications for social and political issues as well. And also that there are alternative ways of organising connectivity and data ownership as well, that move beyond corporate control and beyond state control as well. And one of the big alternatives that people are looking at is mesh networks. I don't have time really to go into the technicalities of mesh networks just now, but that's just to say that they do bypass ISPs, the ISP companies. They completely bypass them. There's a really big mesh network called Wi-Fi that's used in Spain, and with the rolling back of the net neutrality laws in the US, people are starting to use mesh networks there as well. So this is a community organized way of organizing the internet, of organizing connectivity, right? Bypassing ISPs. And there's also ways of taking back control of your personal data ownership. People are working on software platforms that you can use to completely control your ownership of personal data. And that's the Horizon Digital Economy Research in Nottingham University, who I'll be working with. They are producing a big platform called Databox, software that allows you to take more control of your personal data. So that's just to say that these technologies, these alternatives really have the potential to kind of reorganize in some ways society and politics on both a global and a local scale, and I guess ensure like just a more equitable distribution of the profits that are gained at the moment from personal data ownership and internet connectivity. That's all, thank you.
So if you don't mind, we'll keep questions to the end, so we first hear from all the panelists. Thank you, Jacqueline. And from this view of Facebook, India, Southeast Asia, we're moving to another giant of the area, China. And so we have Lengen talking about the Chinese digital economy.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for having me. After hearing about the giants, I'll actually be talking a bit more about the small fish, China's booming startup economy. And so today I'll be talking about China's digital economy and its place in socialist history. My presentation will have 3 parts. I'll start by talking about a recent economic policy called mass entrepreneurship and innovation. And the second part will go on to talk about a Chinese startup cluster, which is very much tied into this economic policy. Finally, the final part will look at how this co-production of startup environment and economic policy kind of serves to situate this growing startup culture within a socialist vision of linear development and modernization. So let me start with mass entrepreneurship and innovation. To give you a bit of background, the idea that information technologies are central to development in China has been around since the 1980s. This sense that there could be a kind of technological leapfrogging, a speeding through the industrial stage right into the information age, has led to large investments in information and technology infrastructure. But alongside this kind of vision of development, there has been a continuous reimagination of Silicon Valley. Specifically in Beijing's Zhongguancun area, which is in the city's northwest, the establishment of technology parks and high-level incubators was aimed at emulating a kind of Silicon Valley-style tech entrepreneurship. And it's important to note that these developments in some ways were aimed at kind of containing and regulating this technological innovation and to have this kind of digital economy within these experimental zones. Of course, I'm simplifying a much more complex process, but I think there was a significant shift in 2013 when there was really a boom of internet entrepreneurship in China. So this whole process of creating startups, apps, software for the digital economy kind of spilled out into a popular sphere. To me, it was quite remarkable when I returned to China in 2013. And a lot of people I knew from earlier who had never been part of the digital economy suddenly saw themselves and their future within this realm of digital entrepreneurship. They would tell me that they're now doing the internet, that as a way of saying that they became internet entrepreneurs. So what happened was that a lot of returnees from the US started creating startup venues, incubators, but also just platforms, coffee shops. One of these, and one of the more iconic ones in Beijing, is the Garage Cafe, which was created by someone returning from the US. He was inspired by these stories of US tech entrepreneurs who had started out in garages to become millionaires. And he wanted to provide China's grassroots entrepreneurs, at least according to his story, with a space where they could fulfill their own dreams. That's the kind of narrative that is built around this place. So the idea there is really that if you buy a cup of coffee, you can spend 24 hours there. It's a place where anyone can come, specifically people who don't have access to these more higher level environments, like these more closely regulated incubators in Beijing. The idea being really that you could just sit down, type away on your laptop, and create an app and become potentially successful. This is also a vision of the digital economy as a low-threshold environment, something that keeps being repeated in Beijing constantly, that the internet kind of opens up entrepreneurship to everyone. So one story that would be told in this cafe is that actually you never know whether or not the person sitting in the corner there is the next Mark Zuckerberg. So it's really a kind of disproportionate vision of opportunity where anyone can become as successful as they might imagine. So my argument is that this posed a certain kind of challenge. It kind of unleashed digital development and digital entrepreneurship within a much broader sphere than had been anticipated in some ways. And the government responded by publicly calling for a new wave of entrepreneurship and grassroots entrepreneurship. This was in 2014 when Premier Deka spoke at the World Economic Forum. This idea was then articulated in 2015 into an economic policy called mass entrepreneurship and innovation. Now here as well, just the name already points to a kind of reference to socialist history and specifically mass politics that you would find during the Maoist era. Of course, it transports it into the present day rather than talking about the masses united in a collective process. Here you're talking about individual entrepreneurs united by digital connectivity. And so an essential part of this policy is a strategy called Internet Plus, which basically envisions national innovation to be outsourced to these internet entrepreneurs, where basically modernization could take place from the bottom up. And this policy specifically mentions the Garage Cafe as an exemplary space for mass entrepreneurship. That's another important side note. So let me jump to Innovate. This is a startup cluster founded in 2014. It's backed by the government, so basically it was created by uniting a government-owned company which owned the real estate and a private company that maintains technology parks in Beijing. Previously, the street had been the Haidian Book City, also a government-backed project. It was a wholesale center for science and technology books. But the Haidian Book City had been deemed to have fallen behind times, and the local government decided to renovate and try to find a different vision, which ended up being a startup cluster. Here again, the Garage Cafe was a central inspiration. The people tasked with envisioning this new space felt that the Garage Cafe, with its open environment and grassroots entrepreneurship, could actually be reproduced as an entire center where anyone could go and become an entrepreneur, an open environment. So of course there are a lot of limitations and problems with this kind of vision, but here I'll focus on how this rather becomes a political effort to align this development with government policy. So the whole street was renovated and given a creative flair evocative of global startup culture. And at the same time, the government maintained a very clear presence. In these designy containers, you'll find government offices where you can register intellectual property or a new venture. So what I want to point out, I think, is here that there's both the symbolic and the material kind of appropriation of startup culture and startup venues taking place here that are very much about the Chinese government claiming what has happened in terms of startup development, what is happening now, and what is going to happen. A good way to make that point, I think, is by looking at the exhibition space that they created very centrally in the street. The lines you see going around the whole room are basically dates referencing a timeline of governmental decisions leading first to the creation of the Haidian Book City and then to the establishment of Innovate. And the whole story is told in very high-level governmental decisions. So here, for example, you have Jiang Zemin, who at the time was the General Secretary of the Communist Party, visiting after the Ideal Book City was established, saying, yes, this is the way we want to go, this is our vision for China. But I think the design is also quite interesting just because once you enter, you're really enveloped by this framework of government guidance and development of decision-making, and really top-down decision-making. So if you look down on this model of Inaway, it's very clearly situated within this government project of modernization. But also the effect of the mirror on the other side. So basically, this is from the entrance, and the wall is a mirror. So it creates this vision of another side, but to actually get there, to get to this possible future, you clearly have to follow this path of government regulation. And it's a very clear, linear sort of direction. Now this was actually reproduced outside. So if you look at the line leading up to the gate, this is the view to the southern gate of the street. In the floor, you will find the same genealogy of government decisions leading up to the gate, so it's etched in the ground. So as you're walking to the southern gate, you're following this timeline of how this place was established by the Communist Party. And as you enter, you're kind of, entering the present, this new place, but it's clearly a product of this history, or at least that's how it is being framed. So the claim, I think, is quite important, and it's highly symbolic also when then Li Keqiang, who is this main figure behind this economic policy of mass entrepreneurship and innovation, comes to visit Inaway. So he's kind of referencing a history of Chinese leaders visiting exemplary places that are essential for Chinese development. He visited this place in 2015, and that was just about 3 months after the street became an exemplary space of mass entrepreneurship and innovation. So even when we look at the history of the street, the development is all but linear. There's a kind of recursion happening where the street is created before the policy comes, but then the street is re-articulated within the context of this new policy, and eventually it is becoming an exemplary space, and as an exemplary space it can be visited from a leading figure of the government. So when he's visiting incubators now within Inaway, he's visiting t-shirt clad entrepreneurs that kind of come to embody this grassroots entrepreneurship and this bottom-up innovation and opportunity for the masses. But that's precisely where it also shifts to very political symbolic, where he's also visiting the masses, where he is visiting an example not just of a local entrepreneurship ecology, but of a startup culture that becomes part of a new kind of digital mass politics. So to summarize this in a final kind of conclusion, I want to argue that this co-production of startup environment and government policy serves to articulate developments in China's digital economy as a product of socialist history. It also reaffirms the continuity of socialist governance despite economic reforms and marketization that in some ways seem to completely reshape the nation. But finally, I would argue that it also claims future developments. It's not just about situating it within history, but about arguing that everything that would emerge from this startup culture is actually a product of Chinese guidance, socialist guidance and governance. And with that, thank you.
Okay, so we jump just to a neighboring country,
Yeah.
and we're going to hear Maitrayee Deka talking about the platformization of the informal economy in India.
Thank you. Sadly, I don't have a PPT presentation, but I'm trying to make sense of what I'm going to talk today. So basically, I'm going to talk briefly about the informal economy in India. It's about 79% of the workforce right now, if we consider the non-agricultural sector in India. So one of the basic definition about the informal economy has also been regarding its ambiguity. But if we have to really generalize, one thing is that there has been a way in which the legal restrictions are much more flexible, and another way in which the organization structure of the informal economy is also something like where trader or a factory owner won't employ more than 10 workers. So I have been doing my research in 3 very popular markets in Delhi, which form part of the informal economy for the past 5 years now. So I've been tracking like how actually the traders, especially in terms of electronic products, have been selling so-called digital goods over time. And one of the new transformations that they have been dealing with is, of course, the platformization of the economy. So I'll try to briefly kind of historicize this process and also talk about the ways in which traders or informal actors are making sense of the platforms, and then leave with some kind of larger ideas and kind of complexities that this might arise. So first to start with, how was the first contact established? Like when I was visiting the traders in 2012 and 2013, there was always this news about the online, and they always use the word online, which in itself says something, because for many of us who have grown up or been part of this digitalization in a much more, I would say, active sense, the online doesn't seem to be an issue at all. But for them, for someone who is not really part of the, I would say, the social network kind of space, it's not like as simple as a digital divide, but just that they have not been using the online network so much for business practices. This seemed like an alien space. So few of the anxieties that was going around is that online is highly regularized space. You need to speak in English to be part of it. You need to have a very specific skill set. So this was like a very, very strong sense of not knowing what is out there. So, and that's something which is going to get them, which is very predatory in nature, and they have no control over it. I was in a way kind of feeling that why are they so concerned about the online, because I could see the business is going well. There's always a lot of consumers coming to the market. It's busy and it's crowded like most bazaars are, if even not to exoticize it too much, but still it's one of those crowded places with business always in full flow. But things start to change rapidly, and I kind of rethink about, in retrospect, I felt like, okay, maybe this was not so much of an anxiety. There was really something they were sensing, because come 2015, this so-called monster or unreliable kind of online gets a more direct sense of what it is. So there is a much more direct contact, and also rather than being distanced from it, now the traders are trying to make real sense of it. So one of the ways in which I saw the traders doing that is kind of talking to chartered accountant, trying to talk to people who are already kind of going to be kind of a mediator in them becoming an online vendor. So they were actually trying to somehow appear more respectable and more legal in order for them to register as vendors in e-commerce sites. So for instance, they would try to shift their, because these are largely gray economy, which are using a lot of fakes and knockoff products. So partially to also to do with how to then make this product somehow seem as company goods and not as a vendor that would be blacklisted almost immediately. So fast forward like another year into the thing, now I see that, okay, there is a fundamental change in how the bazaars are. The look of it changes completely. Something in 2012 where these kind of popular marketplaces are stuffed with goods, a lot of people coming from different places are really like a sad shadow of their past selves, because this consumer range is dwindling. We do not see as many products on the stacked shelf, and few of the main traders of these markets are not even around anymore. So I was very curious to know what happened to them, and one of them I had to literally go to his house and follow him around the city in his new life as an online vendor. And what came out very interestingly is that what were the reservations in their initial years about the online is actually not what has been the experience of them experiencing the online, by which I mean that although they were thinking to be an online vendor, they would need to kind of metamorphose into someone more like formal, someone more regularized in a way, but they were actually using the same kind of trick and bazaar personality when they were even going online. So in a way, they found ways to sell a lot of grey products online by, using a lot of IP addresses and changing the VPN network or obscuring their computers and their IP addresses. Another way they were trying to also kind of get past these regulations was to delete accounts almost immediately if they saw that the company is tracking them and they were, going to be blacklisted in some sense. And interestingly enough, I think what becomes kind of gives this transnational perspective is that the Sanjai or the made in China products become the flow of product through which again this kind of informal vendors get into the platforms in India as well. So what happens is that they always choose kind of made in China products which are very cheap to get, and then they can actually sell it at a higher profit margin online. There are sometimes problems with them because if sometimes the admin personnel sees that this kind of vendor is selling this product at a too less price and also doing a lot of business, so there is a lot of also in a way negotiations happening not to appear too successful in order to get caught. But more often than not, they have somehow found this kind of a balance to not give away their real identity in terms of what kind of quality of goods are being sold online. With this also came a lot of conflicts because, of course, for some of them this was much easier adaptation, but for others it wasn't. It was something still they were negotiating, and one of the things they were doing is that they were trying to also make alliances with so-called knowledge workers in terms of college students, or to find people who are actually good at geeks or hackers who are good at trading the virtual realm. So many of the traders also found ways to capitalize on their friend network or people they knew who were good with hacking into computers and able to kind of trade these online platforms much better. And the flip side of it was that since they were not really in control of this virtual realm, there were also a lot of anxieties about how their money has been taken away by these people who were being entrusted with responsibility. So in a way, the bazaars, which have always been very comfortable with personalized trade networks and a lot of trust networks that are built into their trading network, now kind of sees this shift in terms of having to give a lot of control to other people who they do not really trust but have to in a way trust because they have no other ways to get into this new realm. Now I think there are a few things which becomes interesting in terms of what happens when and why we need to talk about the platforms when economy keep constantly changing, and especially for the bazaars that has always been true because these bazaars have been in existence in some form since the late 16th, 17th century, so it's not something new. They have always been used to change, especially if you look at products itself. Every 2 months or 3 months there's a new product, or if you look at the digital media products in itself, there's a huge shift from selling radios and transistors to selling video games, so they're used to change. But I think for the first time what one observes is the kind of nature of this change is that what was the substantial part of this kind of what Brodel would say face-to-face market exchange and not capitalism. Now we kind of see that maybe for the first time there is going to be a kind of really large shift in the way in which capitalism can and will affect and overthrow the dominant forms of commercial life in places like India. Of course, I cannot leave it in a very bright note, but the thing that bazaar traders are going online means that they are somehow trying to make new livelihood sources. But I think it's important to note that they started with the economy as being micro entrepreneurs. Small-scale traders have been spoken about a lot in the management literature and otherwise as being very frugal innovation, especially in the marketing literature. Indians are known for their frugal nature and how they innovate with almost everything. So these traders have been part of that kind of making do with really less resources and able to somehow function as a much more full-fledged way of being traders and innovators in their own rights. But now having to only engage with something as either vendor. So from an entrepreneur, you start being an employee, and which I think is an interesting shift, because by which you mean that there is more precaritization and proletarization of this kind of labor, but also the sense that now we will only see the knowledge workers as someone having the shots and able to control where the economy is going. And for India, it's an irony, because when more than half of the population is in the informal sector, have but no way just to but give into this kind of broader paradigm of the platforms and startups, which has been highly subsidized and also been glorified because they're apparently more transparent and they're apparently part of the banking system and things like that. So we'll see in the times to come how and where this proceeds. But right now, I think there is a larger, to even talk about the global becomes kind of an oxymoron, because what we see is a more like Eurocentric and a much more Silicon Valley dominance of what these platforms are doing, and maybe it will be able to really take over a lot of the local cultures of commerce and life. Thank you.
I'm very impressed by the time management skills of the panelists. It's pretty unprecedented in academic conferences. We move now to the last presenter, who is going to add another time to this puzzle of the global. Allmann, talking about the Middle East.
Actually looks okay, and I made it on a Mac, so I'm impressed. Not the font I chose, but that's okay, we'll go with it. All right. So I think it's helpful, before I get into the content, the substantive content of my talk, to give you a bit of background about me and the research I've done. I completed my DPhil at the University of Oxford in Oriental Studies of the Islamic world. And my research focused on social media and political resistance after the so-called Arab Spring in Egypt. I was particularly interested in everyday acts or experiences of resistance and subversion as they were aided by digital technology. So I wound up working and focusing in particular on a demographic of pretty young, tech-savvy activists. These were the cyber activists that we heard so much about in the years following the Arab Spring. Although Twitter and Facebook were not solely responsible for the revolutions and uprisings that we associate with the Arab Spring, communications technology did play an important role, especially for certain groups of people. What becomes apparent when you're working on cyber activism in this context, where there's a great deal of enthusiasm and sensationalism and essentialism, clouding the empirical reality of a lived and living revolution, what becomes apparent in that context is how important it is to ask social and economic questions about cyberspace and the people who access it. Cyber activism itself is contingent on socioeconomic status, education, gender, class. Digital activism and the digital economy, in short, have many intersections and altercations with one another. And this really came to the fore for me as the years dragged on after the Egyptian revolution. So my current interest in the digital economy in Egypt emerged out of following my interviewees, who I was working with immediately after the revolution. These were my research subjects. And I followed them through their post-revolutionary lives, and it led me here. So this is a quote from Tarek, that's not his real name, who was one of my interviewees, and this is a quote from when I talked to him in 2016. He said, compared to so many other initiatives, the startup scene is still alive. It's still alive, and you know why? It's probably still alive because the government is okay with it, because it's income generating. It has nothing to do with people who live there. It has nothing to do with anti-government movements. It has nothing to do with human rights. It's purely and simply capitalist, and capitalism is agnostic. Okay, I don't think anyone here would agree that capitalism is agnostic, but to be fair, I think he was being a little facetious. The observation, though, is interesting because it's exactly what I'm going to talk about. The startup scene in Egypt and in the Middle East and North Africa more broadly is very much alive. So this was an accurate assessment in 2016. And Tarek, of course, works at a Cairo-based venture capital firm. It's arguably thriving, the startup scene, even while so many of these countries have seen a re-entrenchment of authoritarianism and political repression in the aftermath of the Arab Spring. After the Egyptian Revolution, the area around Tahrir Square, which was the downtown site of mass protests in 2011, had undergone numerous spatial and cultural transformations. Ordinarily, it had been a bustling traffic circle, notoriously hostile to pedestrians. But after the revolution, for a time, Tahrir became a kind of revolutionary encampment, and every Friday it transformed into a bustling festival of political campaigns and movements. And protesters reoccupied the streets nearby on a regular basis. The roads leading into the square were lined with murals, graffiti, stickers, and flyers for revolutionary causes and slogans, and it was alternatingly a site of popular resistance and state repression, open to the free flow of people and ideas, or closed off with barricades and barbed wire. The revolutionary significance of the square attracted people to the area and spurred new kinds of economic activity as street vendors crowded onto the side streets and licensed and unlicensed cafes popped up nearby. Excuse me. And in 2013, the area around Tahrir Square would welcome yet another new occupant, the Greek campus. And that's what you see down here on the slide. Which is, in fact, a startup hub that just opened its doors a few meters away from Tahrir Square, essentially. The Greek campus is a gated complex that was formerly part of the American University in Cairo's downtown campus. When it reopened as a startup hub in 2013, the site had recently been acquired by a venture capitalist named Ahmed Al-Alfi, who is the founder and chairman of Sawari Ventures, which had been founded in 2010. And Ahmed Al-Alfi envisioned creating a Silicon Valley-inspired technology and innovation park on the site. Sawari Ventures, which funds the initiative, launched its fund, as I said, in 2010, and it's sponsored by Naguib Sawiris, the chairman and CEO of Orescan Telecom Holding. The Sawiris family are commercial giants in Egypt, and Orescan launched Egypt's first mobile operator, Mobinail. The Greek campus has quickly become a hub and spatial symbol of Cairo's growing post-revolutionary startup scene. Today it hosts many of Egypt's and the region's largest startup and innovation events, including things like Social Media Day, the Google I/O Cairo event, and the Rise Up Summit. The Rise Up Summit, like the Greek campus, was inaugurated in 2013 and founded by Abdelhamid Sharara, a digitally savvy and politically conscious young man who grew frustrated with the mounting repression of political participation. Like many young people in Egypt, the political grievances that had led to revolution were bound up with economic grievances, like unemployment and a generally stagnating economy. With political options increasingly closed off in Egypt, Sharara said in an interview for The Economist not that long ago, about a year ago, that he felt there was another way to make it happen, it being the revolution. So he started the Rise Up Summit, which brings together young entrepreneurs, venture capital firms, and startup companies for 3 days once a year. Reading through the Rise Up Summit website and its social media feeds, the revolutionary narrative isn't really hard to find. Hope, change, and empowerment speak to a young generation of entrepreneurs who are themselves often one-time revolutionary activists. And this is one of the images that came off the Rise Up Summit Facebook page. Everything in this ecosystem, the inspiration, the narrative, the geographic location, entwine Egypt's revolution with its budding startup scene. And I would argue that this is neither unique nor coincidental. Figures vary, but venture capital in the Middle East and North Africa has generally increased since 2011, and by a lot. Here's a graph. It's been produced by Thomson Reuters and Deloitte to give just a bit of visual representation, but like I said, figures vary. There's a marked dip in 2013, as you can see, which incidentally was a particularly tumultuous year politically in much of the Middle East, especially in countries that had experienced mass protests during the Arab Spring, but still you can see the trend. There's more venture capital flowing into the region, and there are more startups and certainly more startup hubs and incubators like the Greek campus in Cairo. In 2015, an article in the Huffington Post reported that there were over 100 new shared workspaces in the Middle East, 90% of which were founded after 2011. Of the top 10 most active Middle East regional investors, 8 of them were founded after 2010. In addition, there's been a marked state support of venture capital investment and entrepreneurship. Just last year, in 2017, Egypt's President Sisi announced a $25 billion loan program for small and medium-sized enterprises, or SMEs, to create jobs by spurring entrepreneurship on an individual level. The central bank in Lebanon announced a $400 million plan to invest in startups in 2013. And apart from state support, global financial institutions, NGOs, and transnational corporations have offered support as well. So, by way of example, in 2016, the World Bank invested $50 million to create 2 new venture capital funds in Morocco in the interest of cultivating entrepreneurship. In 2016, Bahrain opened a stock exchange specifically for small and medium-sized enterprises. The investment enthusiasm for SMEs and startups, coupled with the establishment of unprecedented numbers of co-working spaces and startup hubs, led many commentators to label economic entrepreneurship the new or next Arab Spring. It's very easy to find this if you just Google entrepreneurship plus Arab Spring. It's New York Times, Huffington Post, everywhere. In many ways, it's only natural that the ICT-driven entrepreneurship and innovation has so easily taken root, both structurally and ideologically, in the Middle East after the Arab Spring. The economic factors contributing to the growth of the startup scene have dovetailed in interesting ways with the aspirations of a young, technologically plugged-in generation, eager for economic, social, and political change. Many of the prominent organizers of the 2010 and 2011 protests and the subsequent popular movements that came afterwards were themselves trained as software developers, engineers, and data scientists. And many young, once or would-be activists can now be found in the startup hubs and incubators of the Middle East. Kojit, there it is. Kojit, a co-working space for tech entrepreneurs in Tunisia, was founded in 2013 by cyber activist Hussam Aoudi and some of his collaborators. He cited a climate of unemployment and despair among youth in the country as a motivation for establishing the site, which, much like the Greek campus in Cairo, is a serene space set apart, a tech retreat in the heart of the capital city. The year before, a collaboration among international governments, including Britain and the US, and transnational finance institutions like the African Development Bank established Souk Atenmia, a Tunisian program to support budding entrepreneurs with the stated mission of inspiring young people, especially among disadvantaged populations. That's their slogan. And Souk Atenmia hosts events at Kojit, the co-working space in Tunis. Spaces like Kojit and the Greek campus have notably sought to emulate the spatial experiences of global technology companies, such as the US-based Google and Facebook, whose cheerful and immersive office parks have become a workplace model for other tech startups. They adopt bright primary color schemes, as you can even see in these photos, which are evocative of the Google brand. And they have outdoor spaces with non-traditional furniture, like beanbags, to encourage relaxation and collaborative working. These are places where young entrepreneurs can go to hang out, and this is a theme we've already heard today in a few other talks. And it's no wonder they attract young people with all sorts of ICT-mediated interests and dreams, entrepreneurs, artists, and others. These startup hubs capitalize on the rhetoric, optimism, and indeed disappointment of ICT-mediated post-revolution movements, and they've translated it into the spatial vernacular of the global ICT industry. But it's important to situate the Middle East startup scene in a long lineage of economic development that predates the Arab Spring. We can get caught up in the seeming newness of this trend and miss the connections that it shares with economic agendas that do not owe their inspiration to the revolutionary moment. In the 1980s and 1990s, neoliberal economic restructuring resulted in an injection of capital into industries like construction and real estate in countries like Egypt, which is of course the context I'm most familiar with. And this led to the development of new private spaces. In Egypt, these enclosures mostly, for those early decades, focused on the outskirts of Cairo in the desert, and they were known as desert developments. Digital information and communications technologies were a less visible but pervasive element of the spatial reorganization spurred by neoliberalism. In Egypt, the spatial changes that accompanied neoliberalism were a product of merging economic dreams with the promise of technological connectivity. Dreamland, for instance, it is actually called that, was one private development in 6th of October City, which is one of these kind of desert developments, which was advertised early on as, quote, the world's first electronic city, end quote. In short, even before the revolution, new urban developments, new spatial configurations, and new technologies went hand in hand. In the post-revolutionary period, we've seen the development of private spaces for entrepreneurship that really draw on the same rhetoric. The Greek campus's website calls it a tech valley in the heart of Cairo. Kojit claims that with high-speed internet, meeting rooms, whiteboards, projection equipment, a large event space, a beautiful garden, and even a swimming pool, we have everything you need to get work done. Young people are encouraged and enthusiastic to channel their desire for change into these startup spaces, and why wouldn't you be? There's a swimming pool. And this revolutionary narrative aligns easily with a neoliberal agenda that posits information and communication technologies as catalysts for economic development. Entrepreneurship is presented in these contexts as a solution to youth unemployment, one of the key grievances that underpinned the Arab Spring protests. Moreover, especially among international investors and supranational institutions, funding for entrepreneurial startups is often earmarked for innovation in themes like social justice or social impact. In positing entrepreneurship as a solution to both economic insecurity and political repression, these economic development agendas backed by venture capital, international grants and loans, and state sponsorship actually risk entrenching the precarious employment conditions that mire youth in the region in poverty and immobility. So in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, if I follow my research subjects today, I won't be following them into the square to protest. I'll be following them into startup incubators and co-working spaces. In many cases, I'll be following them out of the country and into the global economy. While Ghonim, the revolutionary organizer who famously started the We Are All Khaled Saeed Facebook page that popularized the date of the Egyptian revolution in 2011, was once a Google employee and now has relocated to Silicon Valley to start a startup. Here you can see a 2017 Instagram post up there on the screen on the account for the Greek campus in Cairo, which proclaims Cairo one of the top 7 cities to launch a startup in 2017. The image behind the text is unmistakably a bustling Tahrir Square surging with protesters, and the visual juxtaposition is striking. This, the photo suggests, is the new revolution. So today, and this is my ongoing project now, I have to ask where cyber activism and tech entrepreneurship overlap, where they collide, and what that means for our political futures. Thank you.
All right, thanks to all the panelists for giving us a very good sense of place, a sense of how the digital economy is playing out in very different contexts. And I think that a future historian of the digital economy and of startups will write such a history by tracking the sales of beanbags across the world. should we start up some questions? Yes.
Hi, thanks to all the presenters for great presentations, and it's really interesting to see the way in which the Silicon Valley aesthetic is being appropriated for different ends. My question was for Kira in particular. Where does religion fit in all of this? Your discussion of the kind of, well, it's kind of tech evangelism, right? And the iconography, the aesthetic of the kind of the Rise Up Egypt publications that you showed in your presentation clearly has some kind of religious, they look like a religious tract to me in a sense here. And of course, Islamism was an important part of the Arab Spring, and looking at the kind of people you're talking about, there might be an assumption that these people, with their English language promotion and their discourse and the office spaces, these are the kind of secular liberal side of Egyptian society, and that maybe there's a mass population out there that sees things different. But maybe that's an assumption, and maybe it's more complicated than that, as Islamism tends to be in Egypt. So I was wondering if you could say something about that.
Yeah. That is a really excellent question, and it's actually something that is on very, very much on my future research agenda, in part because in my observations and my discussions with the tech entrepreneurs that I've worked with in Egypt, Islamism and religiosity does not actually feature very prominently in their experiences of the startup scene, and I would venture to say that that's not really that surprising, because in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, there was a more than digital divide that occurred, and but it was really forwarded by the digital divide, which was that a lot of more secular-leaning technological activists really did want to isolate and separate themselves from Islamism and Islamist movements. And that's not to say that there are not tech-savvy, young, English-speaking members of Islamist movements who are very innovative and are occupying similar spaces. But even in the immediate aftermath of the Egyptian revolution, secular sort of leftist-leaning activists were already kind of moving to other platforms. So if you want to think about digital spaces in a spatial way, they were saying, well, now there are all these Islamists on Facebook, we'll just move to Twitter. So there's already the sense that people were kind of relocating themselves and closing themselves off. And what's interesting is now you have a real physical, spatial reification of this in the form of these tech startup hubs in the city, where there are walls and gates, and you actually have to physically enter to be part of them. And those enclosures seem to be replicating that process of excluding explicit religiosity, right? But of course, tech evangelism runs through this entire narrative. And there were efforts, actually, in the years following the revolution by young, more religious Muslim tech users to brand themselves as technologically savvy and edgy and innovative, but also religious. So one example of that would be the Salafio Costa campaign, which was a campaign run by a lot of young Islamists who were really into Facebook and Twitter and wanted to tell the world, essentially, we're Islamists and we're religious, but we're also cool and tech savvy. And I am curious, it is a question I have as well, where those people have gone now. So it's kind of a half question and also a question following your question, but it's a really excellent avenue to pursue, because I think it's really important when we talk about spaces of exclusion to not just say it looks like people are excluded, but interrogate why and how that happens and where they actually are.
And I have a question for Samuel. I was wondering, is the Chinese government an active player in the digital economy? I mean, is just a question of propaganda and cultural hegemony, or there are something like public funding or state-led platforms, or maybe you cited public-private partnership or something like that. And I have also another question, if I may, for Kira as well. Do you think, are there some kind of cultural antibodies to escape from this neoliberal centrifugal force?
And that's a yes or no question.
I mean, if you think there is margin for a sort of reconversion of these digital skills back into political dissent or political activism.
Sure. Would you like to?
Sure, yeah. Thank you. That's a good question. I mean, there are different levels where one can talk, where one can answer that question. I mean, definitely the Chinese government is a player in the digital economy. There is a booming industry, and companies in some ways are quite free to develop and create products, but at the same time there's also a clear understanding that there is government regulation, and you have to follow policy, and you have to provide access, and so on and so forth. If you look at, in a way, my discussion was more about the symbolism, but it's not just about symbolism. So if you're a startup platform going into that startup cluster, you are being subsidized. You pay less rent. Entrepreneurs coming there, not just there, but in general, young entrepreneurs might not have to pay taxes at first. There are different ways in which the government is pushing this quite actively. And at the same time, so if you're part of this startup cluster and you are being subsidized, one thing that the people I interviewed articulated quite clearly is that you have to adopt the government's gaze. So you're not just an entrepreneurship platform anymore, but you have to see yourself within this broader vision. One example that was quite straightforward was when this platform when the startup cluster had been around for a bit, the government pushed this idea of Internet Plus, and within a month, all the individual platforms had events discussing this. You know, what is Internet Plus? How is this part of the government policy? How can we articulate this? How can we use this? So there are different levels of interaction, but definitely the government is a big player.
I guess the simple answer to your question is yes, actually, I'm pretty optimistic. I'm kind of a perennial optimist on the question of whether these spaces can cultivate simultaneously some toxic forms of neoliberalism and capitalism and also resistance and dissent. And I think the reality of, the lived reality of neoliberalism is that we already saw that occur. First of all, neoliberalism in and of itself cultivates dissent anyway, especially among young, unemployed people in every country. There's always the hope that disenfranchisement will lead to frustrations, right? And that will boil over in productive and innovative and creative ways. But the other thing is that we already saw this happen. I mean, the Arab Spring did play out in significant ways on Facebook and Twitter. And these are proprietary platforms that in many ways are purveyors of the neoliberal economy. And so if it can happen there, it can happen in a startup hub. And so I am pretty optimistic, although I think it remains to be seen what the dynamic between private and public support of this startup space will look like. At the moment, it looks like Middle Eastern and North African regimes are really favorable to the startup and entrepreneurship ecosystem and letting it thrive. And I'm curious to see how hands-off they'll be going forward and what that will mean in terms of the economic opportunities that really exist for young people.
Graham, you had a question?
Hi, I should perhaps introduce myself. I'm Claire Milne from LSE over the road. Thank you for having me. All very interesting. I'm an old schooler, as you can see, and I've been fascinated to hear about these startup spaces, tech spaces of the present and future. I'm wondering what's happened to the tech spaces of the not-so-distant past in the form of contact centres, and whether any of you have observations of how they're doing these days, and not just in the business sense, but in the human sense, because I can imagine all sorts of connections between the kinds of people who would be working in one and their perhaps aspirations obviously the two of you who've talked about these startup spaces, but also for the others if they have any comments.
I'm not sure how much I can tell you. I think in terms of contact spaces, the way you mentioned them, one thing that was quite striking to me was how, in a country that has this tradition of tea houses and tea culture, suddenly everyone goes to coffee shops. Now the coffee shop suddenly becomes this strange public, commercial, private environment where you're kind of doing everything. You're meeting friends, you're having business meetings, you're listening to talks. So there is a change. I'm not entirely sure at this moment what exactly to say. There is still
sorry,
this,
but perhaps I should clarify.
Yes, please.
When I said contact centre, I'm talking about call centres also, where people sit with headphones and computers and make or answer phone calls, but also may do business process outsourcing. Sweatshops.
well, I mean, what I can say about China is that they still exist. Factories, all kinds of service industries, definitely. I haven't done research on this, so my information is mainly from what I read in news and literature, but yes, I mean, that hasn't gone away, definitely not.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not sure that I have very much to contribute on the topic of contact centers in contexts like Egypt. I really don't actually know very much about that. I would say that in my mind, kind of the predecessor to these startup hub spaces is sort of more probably the internet cafe, where people would sit maybe at a bank of computers. And internet cafes still exist, but they have definitely fallen by the wayside among the demographic that I have been talking about. And that's for a number of reasons, and it's intriguing, the growth of coffee shops in China, which I did not know about, but in Egypt, coffee shop or cafe culture has always existed, but the nature of upper middle class coffee shop culture has changed tremendously in a very short span of time. So now you have these very Western style coffee shops that really emulate kind of the Starbucks model with specialty drinks and free Wi-Fi and things like this. And those have really replaced, for a lot of people, the internet cafe. So for technological elites, right? And so this isn't everyone, but for technological elites, those are the spaces, these kind of westernized Wi-Fi enabled spaces that they move in now. And that is a transition, aided in part by the growth of those spaces, which has an economic imperative in and of itself, and also by the microtization of internet connectivity. So the fact that people can take their connectivity with them, especially on smartphones and on laptops, so they don't have to be fixed in place anymore. And smartphones, especially among the technological elites, has changed the mobility of people through these spaces. So that transition has certainly occurred. So that socialization that used to happen in internet cafes doesn't happen quite so much anymore because it has moved to these new spaces.
I mean, I also don't research on the call centers, but I have I've seen how it has transformed over the years, like in India. I think the call centers has been the classical information proletariat to start with, and that hasn't changed. I think also what shows is that so much of this startup culture, as Kira mentioned, is a technological elite culture, and maybe if we do like statistically, probably maybe like 0.1% of the population. I mean, rest of, at least in the case of India, are either in the call centers or in the bazaar-like economy. So they are usually the hidden forces of labor. Yeah.
Jacqueline, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, call centers aren't really a big thing in Indonesia, the country that I know most about. But in terms, I mean, if you're interested in the precariousness of work and how that's kind of developing, what I will say, and maybe in relation to what you were saying as well, Maitrayee, about India and the platform economy, that in Indonesia, you find actually that the platform economy, they've got these motorbike taxis that operate the same way that Uber operates, right, on a platform. And you've actually found that's moving in the opposite direction from the West, where people's jobs are becoming more precarious because of these platforms. In Indonesia, people's jobs are moving from the informal economy and becoming much more formalized. And they're having access to opening up bank accounts and access to credit for buying the motorbikes. Whereas here, the Uber people tend to own their cars. In Indonesia, they start off working on these platforms in order to buy the motorbikes or the cars. So it's kind of actually operating in the opposite direction in some ways in terms of precariousness of work. But I don't have anything to say about the call centres.
Hi, my name is Michael Pawlicki and I'm a London-based entrepreneur. Before I ask the question, I would like to contribute to the question by my colleague. I see the future of call centers quite bleak. This week, Google introduced a new artificially intelligent solution called Google Duplex, which actually enables company to remove humans from the supply chain by allowing machines to actually to do the job. And so what we're going to see is more of the kind of solutions that we are now seeing used by HMRC that you call, and you speak to the machines, and most of the inquiry is resolved by the machine. Humans will be basically left to resolve just some of the most unusual issues. My question is to Jacqueline Hicks. You spoke about GDRP and its effect on how businesses will be run, especially the large businesses here in European Union. I'm more interested in how the changes brought by GDRP will affect smaller companies, not the smaller companies that operate on the market today, but what sort of opportunities those changes will bring to startups, okay? Because now, if data is the new oil, okay, is that oil only available to big companies? Can I do something about this? Can I create a startup and European startup? Because most of the time, since this morning, we were talking about American American large companies and Chinese large companies. We haven't got them in Europe, do we? It's time to build them. What are the opportunities here for us Europeans and for smaller companies to use that oil to deliver value? To deliver value, to turn that data into value that we all as a European society can benefit from.
Get yourself over to Asia, where all of the tech-savvy people are producing all of this personal data. No, I don't know. I'm not involved in a business environment, and neither am I an expert on GDPR. That's just a kind of illustration of the differences around the world, about the difference in opinion about personal data. But you want to take advantage. You think there might be some opportunities for small
I hope there will
companies.
be opportunities, because what we are seeing as an entrepreneur, I look at the GDRP, and I look at the notion of big data, and I'm asking myself what the entrepreneur community, what we're supposed to do with it.
Right, because I mean everything that I've read about it is presented as a headache for the companies, right? As a problem. They can now be fined a lot of money. They're going to have to communicate much more with the people that use their platform or their websites or their services, and it's just going to be much more problematic because if they don't communicate effectively, then they can be brought to court and fined. But it's all kind of up in the air, because I think a lot of it is going to be is going to play out through the courts, right? As things settle and there is quite a bit of vagueness in the regulation in a lot of ways. So how it kind of plays out in different countries around Europe might be different as well. So I'm sure someone like yourself will be able to keep an eye and find the niche.
Well, as capitalism says, where there's a problem, there's a business opportunity.
Can I reply to this one? Because I work in the oil business.
Yeah.
I used to work. I worked more than 15 years in the oil business, and I now work in sort of the digital space. And my thesis in social media activism, actually. And if you think about the analogy of the oil and the analogy of that data mining, and you said oil, mining oil and mining data. Okay, I think the phase of the Wild West, the Texas phase, where everyone with a stick could find the oil. That phase, I think, my friends, is over. Okay, so the idea of building a Facebook company in a garage, for me it's fairly difficult nowadays, because the big companies, like in the old days of the Standard Oil Company, has already prevailed. So the idea to have these opportunities like WhatsApp, it's kind of anecdotal from now on, I believe. And the space for entrepreneurs, small entrepreneurs, will be the space that reserved for companies that serve to these companies, or to build your gas station, mom and pop gas station. And a little bit more than that, or at least you find something really, really, really incredible. But nowadays, it is really, really, really incredible. It's artificial intelligence and biotech that is reserved to large corporations.
Sure.
Lots of optimism around the room.
Yeah.
Next question.
Hello, Martin Dishes. I'm with the Oxford Internet Institute. About this question of the current state of call centers, I think one phenomenon to pay attention to that people are starting to write about are these new organizations around content moderation, where people are, which very much relates to this question of the information proletariat, where people's bodies are not used for their voices and their ears, but for their eyes. And for people who haven't seen it, there's a great short documentary that came out this year called The Cleaners, which is a very nice introduction to this.
It's true.
Hi, I'm Elisa from Royal University of London. Love all the presentations, very interesting. I'm particularly interested in techno-entrepreneurship in China, India, and Egypt, and you can see very similar patterns of development. China kind of went through a similar process from revolution to neoliberalism, like what's happening in Egypt. My interest is in this claims of social justice and social inclusion. So Alibaba similarly makes a lot of claims about how it provides opportunities for the grassroots and micro entrepreneurs, people in villages, etc. And to what extent do you see evidence of that? And is there any tension in those processes? And if there are, what are they? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Thanks.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that those are entirely empty aspirations or statements. And to some extent, both private investors and supranational institutions and state governments in the Middle East who have expressed interest in increasing inclusion via entrepreneurship have actually attempted to do so in terms of creating grant programs for marginalized populations. It remains to be seen how effective that is in terms of actually creating sustainable jobs. I mean, this is an incredibly precarious way of providing marginalized youth with employment. So what is interesting is how this rhetoric has evolved around entrepreneurship to kind of situate it in whatever context makes the most sense. So in Egypt, for instance, there's this really revolutionary rhetoric around entrepreneurship, and it sounds like in China there's kind of this socialist rhetoric around it as well that creates an uncomfortable relationship between private enterprise and state agendas. And so in terms of how effective or how attentive or actionable those goals are, I think that remains to be seen, and that is really the question that looms right now, because we're seeing this big surge in startups, but we have really no idea how deeply it's re-entrenching the exclusions that have always existed. We know it is, because you can see that kind of just in an anecdotal sense, but how, to what extent, and to what extent is it actually, surprisingly, including groups or individuals we didn't expect? I think that is the research question that confronts all of us who are interested in this scene, and it's going to take probably a few more years of this playing out for us to really have a good answer, but I think you've nailed the core question there by asking it.
I just want to add to something. I like that you have like a really optimistic picture to paint, because I think you are also tracing it like you start. And I'm always like having a lot of bleak things to say, but I find that unfortunately in the case of India, like there has not been a startup culture per se. I feel it's a very individualized culture, because although we talk about the startup, it's always have been about particular individuals trying to make it in the big bad world, in a sense. And it's also like how it's just about aggregators, so this is not even entrepreneurship per se, but to have actually e-commerce sites which already kind of take into account existing businesses. And as far as developing entrepreneurship culture, I think there is such less conversation with what's happening on the ground, that the only way we see the larger society, which I have seen through the startups and co-working spaces, is as courier labor. So, so that's very interesting, like not able to really have a much more collaborative kind of partnership as yet. But yeah, maybe in the future we see.
I think we have time for one last question. Yes.
Yeah, hi, I'm Aditya from Maitrayee Deka. So I work on call centers still, and it very much went out of the literature. When it came on 10 years ago, it was really like into where people in the West especially were into it. But I still study them in terms of the domestic, the new domestic phase that's coming in terms of India, and very much in other places like Philippines and Kenya and the rest of the places where automation is now coming in, even through the government and the rest of them. So I have a different opinion, but I'll save it for later. We can talk about it. My question is to Maitrayee. So I work with call center workers who are working in e-commerce, and it's still labeled as something that is up and coming in the past 3 years, 4 years or so. Of course, there was the Amazon and the Flipkarts, and then there was like breaking down of their model where they would, try to keep all their call center business captive and in-house, and then they later sort of started disaggregating it to specialized subcontractors doing this kind of work. I just want to have an idea about, like, if I want to go forward with this kind of research question later on, how much do you see? I mean, from your talk, it was evident that the shape is changing of the market itself. The markets are responding to the way beyond. So whether you count it as a sort of a revolutionary change, a paradigm shift, or is it something that coexists with the traditional pace and will continue in some senses? And that's interesting. And whether then sort of there will be co-learning happening over a period of time, both from the perspective of product providers, but also people who involved in services, providing these services.
Yeah, I think, thank you. And just to come back to like why Asia is so interesting for like even this kind of topic is because like I think we had the traditional economic system to start with, and it has still been in existence. But I think it's a paradigmatic shift, at least from where I stand, because a lot of these, either we will have only specific products which are still having a market, like probably food crops and, but for leisure and other kind of consumption, I think it will largely go online. That's what I feel is happening, because it's not just about the consumer, it's also about the traders feeling the pressure from, as you know, from the government, from the venture capital. So there is no support system for them to continue in this environment of demonetization and, you know, all kind of crunch, finance
So
crunch.
you see that as a politicization
Yeah,
more.
Great. So thank you very much for your great questions. There's clearly a lot of issues that can be discussed now during lunch break.